Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Tom Feiling is our kind of author, a travel writer with a penchant for the political. His books poke and probe where others don't. His books include one on Colombia, another on cocaine and the industry surrounding it, and his latest is on Japan. He looks at the quirky and the uncomfortable, and perhaps unlike many authors come journalists, his books take years in the making. He joins us now. Hello and welcome, Tom.
Hello, Nicholas.
Great to have you with us. It's been a while. We were with you, I think, in 2017 in Colombia.
Yes. I went to Colombia with you on my way to Tokyo, and I was there for, all through the lockdown, probably about 4 years, and then I came home for a year, and then I got the commission to do this new book about Japan. So I was in Japan relearning the language and familiarizing myself.
That gives people here a hint, I think, of just how much time goes into your writing. And as I said in the introduction, you had this ideal combination of both. You're a travel writer, but also you're intensely political as well. And your interests match ours completely. How do you get into writing? Because I think you sort of stumbled into it. You didn't set out to be a writer, did you?
No. I think I wanted to be a journalist when I was younger. And then I went to Japan after university. And while I was there, I started getting into films and documentary. So I got into journalism through documentary. But that's a tough business, or it was back then, to make a living in. So I was in documentary production for 10 years or so. And then someone said, instead of bashing your head against a brick wall, you just turn it into a book. So that became my first book, the cocaine book.
And what was that? Just that came out in two different versions, one in the States, one in the UK. What was the title?
That was called The Candy Machine, How Cocaine Took Over the World.
And what was different about that book? Tons of people have written about cocaine. What did you think that you could do that was different?
Well, I think coming from the documentary background, I was very keen on the idea of telling the story, taking a back seat as much as possible and giving the microphone to the people directly involved. So that was the idea with the cocaine book. And I interviewed about 60 people. And the idea was to interview people from the users to the producers and the traffickers. So everyone involved in what is, of course, an illegal business, and a lot of the people on the legal side of things, in other words, the police and the judges and the prison officers, to get a picture of how the business actually works and the problems in banning a drug like cocaine. So without taking out the hot air and the commentary, as much as possible, leaving it to the participants to tell the story. After the cocaine book, I did a book about Colombia, which was more, it was supposed to be Colombia without the drugs. So, the history of Colombia, the conflict in Colombia. By that time, I'd lived in Colombia for a couple of years, and Colombian people get tired of being pigeonholed as the world's biggest cocaine producer. There are other aspects to their country that they'd like the world to know about, and there were other things living there that I found more interesting than cocaine. So I wrote a travel book looking at the history and the conflict. It was the conflict.
Tom, I dropped out there, so forgive me in my lousy connection, but I want to come back to the book you wrote about Colombia in just a second, but I want to stick with the cocaine book, which is, I think you're indicating there, you didn't come to that with an agenda. You wanted to talk about a colossal industry that people it sounds like an anachronism now. It sounds a bit dated, the war on drugs.
Yeah.
I mean, then we had the war on terror after that. But the war on drugs was it goes back to Nancy Reagan. It goes back to the 1980s, and it fueled a huge industry in Central America and in Colombia dedicated to burning crops. But what was your point? Your point was to go and see it at face value and see the impact that policy also was having.
Yeah, absolutely. To go and not just see it for myself, but as I say, to go and find the people who are actually growing coca in the mountains. Why are you growing coca? And look into the problems there. So I suppose it's quite interesting when you, for an outsider, might say, well, it's an illegal business. It must be very dangerous to go and talk to. And I suppose part of, I was curious to see how close you can get without getting your fingers burned. But most of it is not particularly dangerous. I mean, you can go and talk to people who grow coca leaf, and you can talk to people who've been involved in trafficking, large-scale drug trafficking, and have been caught and have done their time.
Yeah.
They still have insights to give you.
So, and you're talking about tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of people who are involved in it in some way or other, from the farmers who are producing it to the people who may be trafficking it, and the people who are involved enabling that process as well. I mean, it's a massive industry, and you're really trying to give voice to that. What were your? I mean, I know we've got a lot to talk about because we're going to talk about Colombia in a second when we go on to the other books. But so I'm racing through this. Did you draw conclusions? I mean, I know you got positive reviews in The Guardian who really saw. I mean, your argument is, well, possibly your argument is saying, where's this war going? This is the policy that's directed to clamping down. This is clearly having no effect. You spoke about the supply of the drugs and the pricing of cocaine as well, that showed that really the policy just wasn't having an impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I wrote that book, I'd been completely immersed in Colombia, and I wanted to talk about Colombia. But at that time, 2005, 2006, in Britain, that's when cocaine was coming into Britain. People were becoming more aware of it. It was becoming a more popular drug. So, quite often when if you go off into these obscure parts of the world and you come back with stories that, they're hard to sell.
Yeah.
So on the subject of that was how I could talk about the actual politics behind the story. It was an illegal drug. It was, glamorous, exciting, dangerous, criminal. That's how you get the readership, and then you sort of smuggle in what you actually
and I think it's quite interesting. The current president of Colombia has actually been arguing for the legalization of Colombia, because there's no way his country is going to get around the problem, and the only way, his argument,
the legalization of cocaine, yes, yeah.
But,
it seems to be something that everyone argues once they're out of office. I think most former presidents of most Latin American countries, once they're out of office, they can, I think Vicente Fox, who was president of Mexico, was once he was out of office, he couldn't have said it in office. The Americans would have gone berserk. But once he was out of office, he said, come on, this is ridiculous.
And at any point during that reporting, did you feel you were going to get your fingers burnt?
No. But then I wasn't trying to talk to people who were actively involved in, at high levels.
Yeah. I'm gonna if I can try and bring up that these books are great. They're great books. Let me just find that other one. It seems to have disappeared from my screen. Hang on a second. I'll find it. Hang on. So here we go. I can't seem to find it. Here we go. Yeah, Candy Street. Yeah, share screen. Here we go. So that was the book we're just talking about. I want to move on in a second though to talk about Colombia. And we were talking earlier. Colombia as a state, I think, is one of the three places in the world that had a huge impact on me and how I look at things. One was North Korea, The other is Israel and Palestine, and that's an ongoing conflict there. And the other was going to Colombia with you. And it really so that's I'll just bring up the other book. It really did have a huge impact on me. I couldn't understand how a state could operate in the way it did. But what were your first experiences when you went to Colombia? What really struck you? What drew you to write about it?
Well, I suppose I was working for an organization called Justice for Colombia. They campaign for trade union rights in Colombia. So that's how I got off the sort of tourist trail and out of the whole issue of drugs as well. And then it opened up a whole other side to the conflict there, because people here, we know that, they're terrorists, the FARC terrorists, they're blowing things up. But then by working for this campaign, and I found out about, there was, you have the guerrillas on the left, but then you have the paramilitaries on the right who were fighting people like trade unionists and people campaigning for land rights. So the whole question of who had power in Colombia and what the issues, every issue seemed to be fought over, contentious, violent. And there was a left, there were armed leftists and armed rightists. So yeah, I started to get into the conflict. Because the whole war on terror and the war on drugs were two sort of big tabloidy distractions, really, from what was essentially a civil war, low, bubbling away, simmering in the background kind of civil war.
Yeah.
So it was very interesting to go and look into that. But yes, it was that campaign, the Justice for Colombia campaign, that we got trade unionists over from Colombia to talk to trade unionists here and to raise awareness of what was happening there. At the time, it was the most dangerous country in the world to be a trade unionist, and I think the most dangerous country in the world to be a journalist. Of course, now it's actually Colombia's a very safe country, and Venezuela's gone berserk. But
yeah. I think there are two things that really struck me, and they sort of coincide with each other. There's an overlap there. One was it's a big country, and in terms of the geography of it, it's incredible. You've got the Caribbean, it's got a Caribbean coast, but it's incredibly mountainous. It's also got part of the Amazon. There are no major roads. There are no main roads linking the main cities. If you want to go from Medellin to Bogota, essentially you've got to fly. Same thing if you're going to go to Medellin down to Cartagena, you've got to fly too. Even if you're in a small provincial town, if you want to get your goods to market, it could take you half a day because the roads are so bad. And that was the state's inability to provide what I would think of as basic services for a country in some ways is quite developed in terms of, you look at the cities and the way the cities are built. And then also, they've got, incredible mines that produce coal. There's not a lack of, income in some ways. So that was the geography of it was the thing that struck me. And this came through from our tour. We met a woman on our tour who came from a very poor area of Bogota, and her son had been picked up in the barrio, the area that they lived in, Bogota, and recruited by the army, ostensibly to go and work on a coffee plantation in the north somewhere. And they put him in a military uniform, and they put others in a military uniform, and they were later found shot dead. And he was accused, and this is a mentally disabled boy who was taken from near his home. They were accused of being FARC guerrillas or leftist guerrillas. And this was a conspiracy by the Ministry of Defense or by parts of the army to increase their kill, to show that they were killing numbers of the opposition, if you like. Here was the state that was killing its own people. There are the two things there that really struck me, and they come out in your book. about, first of all, a state that really doesn't seem to serve its own people. And you've got stories there that come out there. So just if you could just give us a few, maybe a vignette or two that comes from your book.
Yeah, well, just picking up on that scandal that you mentioned, where I can't remember how many people were found to have been killed by the army, but I mean, as you say, it does show, being able to, you're waging a war on terror, presumably to defend democracy, to defend ordinary people, but the willingness to kill ordinary people from poor parts of the city, that tells you a lot about a country. The fact that they weren't prosecuted, they got away with it, tells you an awful lot about the impunity in Colombia, how ineffective the legal system is. It was also the kill rate, the kind of box ticking thing of we're fighting the guerrillas. Who were they trying to kid? I mean, but I suppose the answer to that is they were dependent on the Americans for funding for Plan Colombia, and this was a way of showing that we're doing results. So you and I have talked about this sort of idea of Colombia. To what extent is it still a colonial creation? It was created. It begins as a colony, a Spanish colony, and when you see this kind of box ticking, I think this is a very colonial habit where the master shows up for a day, you do all your bowing and scraping and show that you're doing everything that you're supposed to be doing. He then goes back to the distant capital, be that Madrid or Bogota, and then you're free to get on with kind of Wild West behavior again. The law no longer matters.
So this, I mean, there's sort of colonial origins of that, and I sort of get that. But this comes also back to the idea of geography as well. If you don't have roads going out to small mountainous areas, the reach of the state is evidently going to be limited.
Yeah, and I think the state, you don't have to travel very far from a Colombian city, an hour or two, and you really are in a place where there's no state presence. There's no, bare provision of education, health. So when we were there, I think you'll concur with what I say, that we went to some places where the roads were, even if you grew crops, there weren't roads that you could take your goods to market on. And for a lot of people in those areas who'd been driven by violence to go to these peripheral areas, they were farming to feed themselves. The first experience they had of the state really was the army showing up. And then maybe you get some sort of emergency health workers treating your children for malaria or diseases that really should have been eradicated long. I mean, malaria is not a good example, but
and then I remember going to the presidential palace, and we walked down one of the corridors, and it had all the photographs and portraits of the Colombian presidents. And Tom, they looked like you and me. I mean, they were they were white men. They were aging white men, and which reflects what percentage of the population? Maybe 10% of the population is probably, if you think about the conquistadors, the people who have historically been the major figures within politics and the economy and are still there. But when you've got a mixed population with indigenous descent, and then you've got a black population too. And obviously, I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, but they don't show up among the leadership. And Pedro, the new president is perhaps a shift in that shows things are changing. But for me, it was the first time I've been to a state where, what we talk about in Europe, it's the social contract. It's the idea that the legitimacy of the government depends upon its ability to serve the people. And that's what elections are about. And I think your book, and I recommend this to everyone watching, it's called Short Walks from Bogota, has got lots of short little stories that highlight this in many ways. And it's still, whilst you wrote this, I think, when did it come out, Tom? When was it?
2012. So what's that? 12 years ago.
12 years ago. It's still very relevant. I mean, a lot has changed, but the fundamentals haven't. Anyway, so I think Karen's popping in next door to see if my computer can work or not. So yeah, I might be able to go back next door. Let's see. So after Colombia, you wrote another book and haven't mentioned it so far, and that was about the island of Providence. Where is Providence, and what took you there?
Providence belongs to Colombia, but it's an English-speaking island in the Caribbean. It's about 500 miles north of Cartagena, so it's in the Caribbean Sea.
That's a long way off, isn't it? I mean, that's pretty remote.
Yeah, it's in the middle of nowhere. I learned about it when I was in Colombia, but once I started looking into it, the eventual book I wrote, it's really a story about the early British colonies, and this a time when the English colonies in New England were. It was in the balance whether or not the British Empire would get its first footing in North America or Central America. And Providence was the Central American connection. So it was around the time of the colonization of Barbados, very early, sort of 1630s. It was a very short-lived colony, and there was a struggle on the island between the Puritans and the pirates. So that too, I took as kind of emblematic of the British Empire then and since, that it always had a kind of an evangelical Christian motivation and a very rapacious, swashbuckling.
A lot of the book was about the history of the island and its evolution. But what's it like today? What's there now?
Well, it's still English speaking. Most of the families there have got connections to Jamaica, so it's English speaking African descent families, but very mixed. It's got a population of about 5,000 people. It's about 5 miles long. It's a very lovely, peaceful place to spend time. I had a great time. Their library was pretty limited. I arrived with all the books I could find about Providence and a lot of books about, Caribbean history. And I interviewed a lot of people there. But it was just, a very charming island, a lovely place to spend time.
In a way, I think it's possibly your most sedate book because it's not poking at questioning a key issue. I'm going to move on to Japan. When did you move to Japan? When did you move from Colombia?
Well, when I wrote the Colombia book as a kind of goodbye to Colombia, in a way. So that's 2012, and then, I went back to do the political tours. Went back to Japan after that for 4 years or so. Trying to get this. I wanted to write a book about the population crash that is in Japan's at the head of this movement. It's a global phenomena you see where the birth rate's going down, the society is getting older, and Japan is a generation ahead of most of the rest of the rich world, and it's actually shrinking. The population is shrinking by more than 500,000 a year.
That last point is a really interesting point, Tom. So when you say it's ahead, your implication is basically most of the Western world is heading the same way as Japan, and the statistics back that up. Yes.
So I wanted to, I wanted to look into this, the consequences. How do societies deal with this when you have 30% of the population are retirees or 40%? It's creeping up in Japan all the time. There are a lot of things in Japan that I suppose are applicable elsewhere, but a lot of the factors at play are very Japanese. And I suppose the lesson in each country has its own even if you have the same low birth rate, you have different reasons for the low birth rate. But it was a leaping off point to think about, a long-term perspective. The next 30, 40 years is going to see really dramatic changes in the makeup of rich world countries. There are no rich world countries that are reproducing themselves, where the birth rate is high enough to sustain itself. So they're all going to be shrinking.
So what's just give us? I want to talk about some of the places you visited in a moment, but just give us the statistics. It's that the birth rate has to be 2.2% to replace yourself, and Japan is was at 1.57 in the 60s or something, and now it's at 1.2. What can you remember what the figures are?
I think it's about 1.3, but that's not unusual. Once you look into it, I was amazed. Jamaica, for example, has a lower birth rate than Japan. So Jamaica will shrink. Thailand has a lower birth rate than Japan. The birth rate in Mexico is the biggest fall in human history. You go to Iran, all of these countries, there's very few countries that are going to escape this. If you look at
we're sort of we're almost making a cliche out of Japan and using that as a projected, that's something that's happening elsewhere. It's not happening to us, but there's a large amount of denial here.
Well, even with mass immigration, the British birth rate, similar to European birth rates, they're all below 2. 2.1 is what you need to sustain your population, but they're all below that.
Well, hold that thought in a second, because I mean that raises a big question about immigration, migration. But before, can you just describe some of the places you've been to? I'm really particularly thinking about those rural areas, villages that I presume are just dying out.
Yeah. Well, I started in Tokyo, and the first third of the book is looking at Tokyo and why is the birth rate so low, and so many people not coupling up, not getting married, not having children, choosing to live alone. So it was exploring all of that, the sort of breakdown of the family in Japan. And then I started traveling around. I had about 6 months just traveling around Japan. I've spent many years in Japan. Well, probably about 7 years of my life I've been in Japan, and never really had a chance to look around. So it was great and I did a lot of it by bicycle as well. And, it's a very beautiful country. It has parts of it that were very Mediterranean, orange orchards and peach orchards and crystal blue seas, and really quite delightful. But, I'd go days without seeing a child.
Wow.
There were no children.
And houses that are empty.
An awful lot of empty houses. Yeah, it's currently about 8 million empty houses, and it's going up all the time.
This has got echoes for me of being in the Balkans, and not so much. Kosovo had actually a famously growing population, but if you go to parts of Macedonia, southern Serbia, and rural Greece, villages that are dead, just empty, houses that are collapsed. I remember going to a village and writing a story about a village in southern Serbia. Again, only one family that had children. The school had closed. Everyone was moving away. Beautiful houses. Really, 200 years old, 150 years old. So very, very attractive. So, what as you see it, what are the reasons? I mean, famously, we think of the Japanese as hardworking, obsessed with work, not having enough time to construct relationships. Your book doesn't come out until the autumn, so I'm asking you to give it away before it's come out, but give us some of your conclusions.
Well, I kind of wanted to blame the culture of overwork. But Japanese people aren't working as hard as they used to. The country's got rich. It's not South Korea. It's not China, where people are still working all hours. And they, when Japan was like those countries, when they had, white hot economic growth rates, and they were the manufacturers to the entire world, and everyone was working all hours, everyone was getting married and everyone was having 2 point something children. So at heart, well, there's certainly what's new about now is that Japanese women are going to work, and I suppose that's the essential. When you look at declining birth rates around the world, not just Japan, it's about women going to work. And in the Japanese case, not only in the Japanese case, but coming into a conflict with gender expectations of, who's going to look after the kids and why should I sacrifice my career? So all those sort of conversations. But then there's other factors, more modern factors, that I think in Japan, a lot of people simply can't be bothered with relationships and are quite happy to live by themselves. And that's what makes life in Japan interesting, is the number of people who are living alone, I never saw families out and about, the family holiday or the family restaurant. It was just had such an old-fashioned ring to it. And when you walk into restaurants, you very often see people eating and drinking alone. In the coffee shops, people alone. An awful lot of solitude. And although there were frightening sides to it, of people, who had become complete recluses, by and large, you had to say, well, they're making solitude look feasible, doable, perfectly attractive state of affairs. It's all too easy to say, well, why don't you shack up with someone and have some babies? It wasn't, it was pioneering a new way of urban living where you can live alone.
And I guess I'm going to say at this point, please, everyone, if you've got any questions, whether it's about cocaine, Colombia, or Yakitori in Japan, please do put them down in the Q&A box so we can put them straight to Tom. But I think it's your conclusions are this is not just you've talked about things that are Japanese values and the product of Japanese society, but really this is about modern society. This is about modern living, about Western, but we can't be bothered with having families. There's so many, we want to do other things instead. We want to go and enjoy other things.
Yeah. I mean, there are other. It's a really complicated story, and trying to tell it, I found there were so many aspects to it. It is a tough. It's not something that you can put in a nutshell, and I don't think I'm going to have a conclusion like, what we need to be doing is this. I
think you said, China, South Korea, I'm trying to think of some other major places that have got the same birth rate as Japan. One of the things that you think you talk about is that sex, having the Japanese, seem to be not having sex at all, and the Greeks claim to be having more sex than anybody else. But what's the truth of it?
Well, this was surveys that I read of, when they asked people, how often do you have sex? I mean, I don't know if you can trust the answers that people give, but they always the results are always presented as a fait accompli. You just have to take them as read. But if you believe what people say, the Greeks have sex more often than any other nation on the planet, and the Japanese have sex the least often. But the point is, their birth rates are basically the same.
Yeah.
So, having lots of sex doesn't mean that you're going to have a wonderful. Well, and I say wonderful birth rate. I mean, a lot of people would say a declining birth rate is no bad thing. We have an environmental crisis.
Yeah.
So it's hard to be conclusive about what should be done, because it's hard to be conclusive about the extent to which it is a problem. But definitely, it's a very.
In a second, I want to talk about immigration, because Britain, for example, has, although our birth rate is declining, we've made up for some of it, at least in terms of immigration, and there's controversy that goes with it. So let's come back to that in a second, but let's take a few questions to start with. Marty Ryan, who I think is in Connecticut. Go ahead, Marty.
Yes, this is really interesting about the birth rate all around the world. But my question to you is, what impact do you think technology might be having on this change?
So, I mean, Tom, I think the question is, so Marty, are you talking about what aspect of technology, Marty? Just to be a bit more precise about that.
Well, I'm just thinking of technology is so pervasive, and my view is that the use of technology has diminished our ability to have interpersonal relationships and even know how to have conversations. And
so you're talking about use of personal technology, you're talking about phones, you're talking about computers, the lack of social intercourse due to our ability to be entertained by ourselves. Yeah,
and I'm just wondering how that might impact people's willingness to be alone and not develop the kind of relationships that would lead to marriage and children.
Tom.
Well, it's not black and white, is it? Here we're talking about birth rates around the world over Zoom. If it weren't for the internet, we'd probably be in our respective pubs trying to talk to people in the pub about declining birth rates and getting, stared at. And we'd end up having boring conversations about, I don't know, crop yields or the state of the roads. So this is an example of how technology is facilitating communication, isn't it? I think if everyone in parts of Japan where you see the younger generation, everyone's got their own flat. They've got very solo lives. They're not living in families, but that doesn't mean they don't have connections with people. And the internet allows you to have connections with people outside your immediate area.
Yeah.
But
I'm absolutely gripped by this, Tom. I mean, for me, the best example that I can see a transition from a society where the family is everything and where growth rates are very high is Kosovo, where I was a correspondent for more than 5 years. And okay, it was part of former Yugoslavia and it did have an industrial base, but it was still very agricultural, and the family was everything, and big families were the norm. And really, and to a degree, this happened in the 80s and the 90s, but it happened dramatically, I think, after the end of the war in 99. You had a huge migration away from Kosovo with refugees, but those that stayed in Kosovo, there was a middle-class lifestyle that emerged. People bought flats, people bought houses for their own family, and there was no longer a pressure on you to have 6 or 7 children. The conflict had gone, and your response to the conflict was to have a big family, because you would send sons abroad or children abroad, and they would send money home. And then that pressure had gone, and you had more independence. You didn't have that need to have so many children. So there's I know that's purely anecdotal, but that's for me the sort of the shortest contraction, if you think, between having a society in which a large family is a necessity to one where it's not, it's seen as an extravagance.
Yeah, and I think it's quite interesting that countries like South Korea and Japan have very low birth rates, and so do Southern European countries. Spain, Italy, Portugal, very low, much lower than Northern Europe. You start looking into that, why is that? And it comes down to, I think, the church, the strength of the church in holding families together, and very strong social norms about you must get married. And the church has just lost its strength, hasn't it, in Southern Europe?
Yeah.
I think also in Italy, kids don't have the money to leave home. They end up living at home much longer. But perhaps that always was the case, that you lived at home until you got married. So
I want to start in just a moment, but before I do, I think
Tom, we've really got to address the other issue. And this is the big thing that we're butting up against in terms of Western politics, and that's migration. It's noticeable that here in the UK, Brexit was really one of the key issues was migration, taking back control of our borders. And in some ways, it did cut migration, notably from Europe. But we see there's been a massive replacement from outside of the European Union. Our economy is very hungry for migrant labor. We can't supply the labor ourselves, so we're importing people to do it. And this is the equation. And this is if you've got societies that are literally dying, you need to bring in people to replace them. How do you see that? How do you see both sides of that argument, and how does it play out in Japan in particular?
Well, Japan has been holding off on mass immigration for a long time, and as a result, it has chronic labor shortages in a lot of sectors, particularly the sectors that young people don't want to work in. So if you look at the farm sector, the average age of Japanese farmers it's in their 70s. That's the average age of a farmer. So they're importing more and more food. If you look at the building trade, all the average age of the carpenters and the builders, they're all in their 60s and 70s. Wow. It's not sustainable, and they've been umming and ahhing about this. I think the younger generation are more, okay with the idea of immigration, and the older generation is more hesitant. But even in the last, it's changing really quickly in Japan. The foreign population is much bigger than it used to be. And you see a lot of foreigners in white-collar jobs as well as blue-collar jobs, and not just in Tokyo. So things are changing fast. And it creates a very interesting situation, because it's a very novel experience for all concerned. A lot of the immigrants are coming from the Philippines or Nepal, Bangladesh. They have, no prior experience of Japan, and Japan has no prior experience of them. So both sides, I suppose, are cagey. But I must say, from my point of view, I thought, well, you don't have all the imperial. You have a small amount of imperial baggage, but it's not like the European powers where immigrants largely come from former colonial possessions. And I thought maybe this could work if over the next 40 years to get to the stage where 10-15% of the population is not native ethnicity, not Japanese native ethnicity. It could all be a very interesting experience and an interesting experiment.
But there's going to be political fallout. There's got to be. Let me. That's my conjecture. Diane Cook, let's, because I think you've got a comment as much as a question on this, Diane. Go ahead with your thought or question.
Well, yeah, it's in the same vein, Tom. It's that when one reads about this this issue rather than a problem around the world, it's always very often couched in the impact on older people and the burden of older people and so on. But what I wonder, and you perhaps can see it in Japan, is what does it do for your industry in the country and investment in the future? So if you look at all the huge successful Japanese companies from the past, not just in what they're making, but the idea of creating wealth and creating companies. How do you see young Japanese people? Do you see them picking up on that and still wanting to create wealth and investment, or are they behaving slightly differently?
Well, there's kind of two related problems. On the one hand, you have all the demographic problems that, broadly speaking, the proportion of young people is shrinking and the proportion of older people is increasing. So the whole mentality of the country gets a bit stodgier, let's put it like that. But you have a related problem, which is the, zero economic growth in Japan for several decades. The economy is stagnating. It's a strange situation. Japan has loads of money, but nowhere to invest it at home. And why would you invest money in a shrinking market? So that encourages more and more investment overseas. Cash-rich companies investing overseas, paying taxes in Japan, which goes to support a large retired community. So I think, it's kind of, you get the feeling that you're in very uncharted territory. But to return to your question, I mean, I think a lot of young people, their fathers grew up with working for big companies where they had lifetime employment and, steadily increasing wages with seniority, the whole salaryman lifestyle. And there's been a real rude awakening in Japan that there's no more lifetime employment. It's 0 hours contracts, it's gig economy, it's still working in 7-Eleven at the age of 35. It's not having the money to get a flat, to rent, let alone to buy. It's a lot
and then
of
you don't have the security, so you don't feel you can get married. Yeah, and that accelerates that.
Yes,
that cycle.
So the general lack of security, which goes with the modern economy in Japan and in the UK and in the States, it makes you can see how that undermines the commitment that it requires to say, let's have a child.
In a moment, Tom, you've got to give us your business idea that sort of contributes to that idea of the economy not being able, not investable. Tom has actually got an idea to ship bits of it out of Japan and sell it to other countries. We'll talk about that in a minute. So, Lois, you've got a comment on this as well. You were there in 2019, Lois, weren't you?
Yeah, I was there, and I've actually got two comments and more like both comments. The first time when I was there in because the other one is on the use of the technology, etc. And I'd prefer to anyway. When I was there in 2019, I met a friend that's living in Tokyo. He's originally from England, and one thing I really noticed was that you'd see groups of young women, you'd see groups of young men going out, out on the town. You would see couples, but you never saw mixed groups of young people. Now, when you go out in Australia, you always see mixed groups of young people, girls and guys that went to school together, basically go out on the town together. And my friend commented, he said it's an incredibly segregated society and that the language men and women use is quite different. So that you can either talk like a woman or you talk like a man. That's the first one. The second comment is really on technology and that possibly technology is ruining our social skills. I grew up and spent my teenage years in a small country town. Our only entertainments were getting drunk and having sex in cars. Frankly, I love the internet, but young people have got things to entertain them and divert them, and they don't have to resort to such behaviours, and that they can think of a world outside their little country town. So I'm all for technology for young people because I think it definitely improves their horizons. We don't have much problem with teenage drinking, and we certainly don't have a problem with underage pregnancies. So that's my bit.
Yeah. It is interesting how segregated Japan is. I suppose, young Japanese are just burdened with very different expectations. It's still quite a stodgy, conservative country, and men and women have always been expected to play very different roles. And now all of that is being uprooted. So there's quite a lot of confusion. But you do see that a lot, that boys and girls, when you see the kids after school, and they don't mix a lot.
So, Tom, I want to. It's a frivolous comment in a way about your business. Tell us about your business idea, but I think there's a serious point to it as well. But there's some really beautiful houses. Those villages that are disappearing have got some really wonderful buildings there.
Yes, I think this is another of those things you couldn't have predicted even 10, 20 years ago. But in Japan, you have an awful lot of empty properties where the owners are dying or going into nursing homes and leaving behind properties that their kids have no interest in taking over. So you have, I think, it's upwards of 8 million empty properties across Japan. A lot of them are old, wooden, very charming houses built sort of before the war, particularly in the countryside. A lot of the old farmhouses, very beautiful, made of wood, with a lot of carved wood. And my bright idea was, couldn't you just take them all to bits, put them in a shipping container and ship them off to, because these houses sell for less than £10,000, often less than £5,000. The only problem is that, well, I think one of the reasons why the kids don't want to take them on is because they are a bit uncomfortable from a modern person's point of view. They're a bit cold in the winter. But if you were shipping it off to somewhere like, Spain, Italy, somewhere dry and largely warm.
I reckon you've got a market in Australia or New Zealand. You've got, it's not quite as far as Italy or Spain or wherever. But here's I think there's a serious point to this. Where's the growth going to come in that economy? It's not apparent. Europe's growth probably comes from migration, but it can't deal with that. Politically, it's explosive. Is it going to do it? Is it not going to do it? Do you accept some societies, do you accept countries are then going to go into decline? How do you manage that decline? So there are big issues. On the one hand, you see populations of Africa expanding massively. Kinshasa, 1997, I think population of 2 million, 17 million now. In 2080, 100 million. Massive population growth. At the same time, Europe, as we've said, population growth going down and stagnating. Can that be the solution? Or do you accept that some states, some countries, some societies are going to crumble?
Well, there's certainly Japan and South Korea and China. They're going to get a lot smaller, aren't they? But I suppose what's interesting is in Japan, they're still coming up with some really amazing inventions. Perhaps those inventions but they're global products. For example, in response to climate change, I visited some farmers who were developing growing crops without soil. Hydroponics, quite amazing stuff. And it's just a reminder of all the scientific innovation that Japan's become famous for, in the post-war period, the 60s, 70s, 80s. You can see it's definitely drying up. It's all under threat, partly because the government has to spend so much money on long-term care, medicine, pensions. It's eating into R&D and education. The education system is getting weaker. But those kind of inventions, perhaps you wouldn't make your money in Japan. As I say, it's a shrinking market. But if you can develop them in Japan and then roll them out, it's a global product. It has a global application. So Japan perhaps can still thrive in a globalized economy with half as many people as it currently has, of whom half are old.
Yeah, and much more mixed than it is now.
Yes.
So whether like it or not, it has to have that labour. Just as Brexit has proven, we can't get away without importing workers. It has to happen some way or other. Listen, I think we're going to wrap it up there. When's your new book out on Japan, and what's it called?
I think it's going to be called Alone in Japan, and it's due out in the spring of next year, spring of 2025, with Alan Lane in the hardback and then in Penguin for the paperback.
Great stuff. Well, I'm really looking forward to it. Listen, thank you very much for the question, and apologies for the communication problems there and the hiccups at the beginning. That was very frustrating. But we managed to get it. I think I'm going to be buying a new computer. Thank you very much indeed, Tom. It was a really good discussion. And
My pleasure.
We'll
Good to chat with you again.
Yeah, good to talk to you again too.